Gracie and I are at the coal mines today, and where Gracie's patiently laying there is the old garden from the coal mines. It's located behind the military barracks. At one time they had 15 acres in production here. Now the subject of the video today is what a convict's daily menu would have been like and where the food would have been sourced for that. When the convicts originally came here in 1833 to the coal mines, all the food would have had to come across from Port Arthur. It would have taken a couple of years to get this garden into operation here, so the food supply from Port Arthur would have depended on the weather, how many ships they had at the time, and how much they were growing over there to supply the coal mines. So one could probably suggest that at times the food arriving here was in poor condition, and it might have been of a limited amount. There's a little display down here giving some information about the garden. There's a sign here, it tells you the production in 1846, keeping in mind that they arrived here in 1833. There were 20 tonnes of potatoes, 2 tonnes of carrots, 2 tonnes of turnips, 20 tonnes of cabbages and half a tonne of leeks. Now, sounds like a little bit, but keep in mind there were probably 350, 400 people, that's convicts, civilians and military, located at the coal mines at the time. So that was hardly going to keep them going for 12 months. In fact, I think the coal mines was only self-sufficient for 3 months of the year. They had problems early on here. 1834 there was cases of a scurvy outbreak. The food had to come across from Port Arthur, and the food, when it did arrive, may have been in very poor condition and limited amount. So scurvy outbreak, they gave the convicts lime to help alleviate the problem. Now there's a couple of things that happened early on in the settlement that did allow the convicts to be provided with food here, or better sources of food than when they initially landed here, and we'll have a look at a couple of those locations now. Gracie and I are now down at where the Saltwater River probation station was originally located. It was built in 1841 and it was designed to be a farm for Port Arthur, for the coal mines, for Impression Bay, Cascade, the probation stations that were located down here. It's a large area under cultivation when they were here. In 1842, a year after they started here, they already had 50 acres under production. In 1844 it went up to 114, and those numbers got bigger in the years after that. Now, the soil here is a lot better than the coal mines. You can even see the grass that's in front of me is bright green, and in the background that white shed was originally a stable for the settlement here. The buildings here lasted a lot longer than the coal mines, because once the government had finished with these buildings, they were sold off to the civilian population, and the civilians managed the buildings a lot better than the buildings at the coal mines that were allowed to deteriorate over time. Having this farm located so close to the coal mines now enabled the convicts at the coal mines to have a more reliable source of fresh vegetables than they had before. Previously they had to either try to grow some themselves, or it would have to come across from Port Arthur. So this settlement here was a blessing in disguise for them. Now in 1841, not only the farm at Saltwater River opened up, but they also opened up a slaughterhouse at King George Sound, which is across the bay from the coal mines across Norfolk Bay. And there they had a abattoirs operated by the convicts, and they slaughtered cattle there that was to be distributed to the probation stations across the peninsula as well as Port Arthur. This meant that they had a bit more of a reliable source of meat coming to the coal mines than they had previously. And Gracie and I are in the Cookhouse Bakehouse. This was the first real kitchen bakery they had at the coal mines. Before this was built, I believe the convicts had to cook their own food at the end of the day's work. Now how that was handled, I don't know, whether one convict threw everything into a pot and boiled it away. I can't imagine everyone trying to cook the food at the same time, or how even that food would have been rationed out. You can see under Gracie there, that's a window where a window was once, but below it you can see some brickwork here, and I believe that there was the entrance to the bread oven, and then the bread oven used to protrude out this side of the building here towards the chapel behind Gracie there. As the population grew here, they had to increase the amount of kitchens and bread ovens. And Gracie's sitting outside one of the bread ovens here at the Cookhouse Bakehouse, as it's known. There's one there, and there's one located here, and I believe on the other side there's another two that come up on the sides of each one of these ones that are located here. And this large area here would have been a cooking area, also where they would have done the baking for the bread. When doing my research for this video, I couldn't find a set standard menu of what the convicts ate at the coal mines. I've based this on a bit of a snapshot of what the miners' menu was at one time, but even that was subject to change. The miners got a little extra ration of flour at one stage, but later on that seemed to be taken off them. Some of the items here are mentioned by convicts who were at the coal mines, and even between those two convicts they seem to differ slightly on what the menu was. But we'll go with what we've got. So the convicts were issued around 900 grams of white flour per day. Now they wouldn't have just walked away with that each morning. That flour would have gone to making their bread, and they had around 1 kilo of bread a day as a ration. 2 cubes they call it, and it's slightly over 1 kilo what I've got here, but close to it. Now I factored in they probably used about 650 grams, 700 grams of flour for the bread making, and then what they had for breakfast was known as skilly. And at the coal mines, the skilly was described as simply water and flour. So I've used the leftover flour from the bread making in that skilly. Now that does even differ locally here. A convict who escaped went across to another probation station where he was captured, and they gave him breakfast there, and the skilly had oatmeal in it as well as flour. But the convict at the coal mine said that the skilly was only flour. Now at other times this would have been made from the leftover from the broth from the night before, and there might have been a couple of dregs of vegetables or something in the bottom of that if they were lucky. But there's our appetising 1 litre of skilly for breakfast that he could have combined with the bread. Now also on the menu he was allowed 28 grams of tea and about 60 grams of sugar and another 28 grams of salt. That's a fair bit there. I suspect the tea was just made up into a big pot which they had for breakfast, and then they also would have had that probably with their when they come back in the afternoon. The sugar and salt, some of that would have been used towards the bread making, and then the rest of the salt would have been used towards the meal. Now as for the meal itself, the main meal, what we call lunch they used to call tea, they had 340 grams of fresh meat or salted beef, or they had 450 grams of salted pork, and with that they had about half 1 kilo of vegetables. So in this appetising broth I've got here, I've used lamb in this case. Lamb was available at the settlement in the early days. Now, 2 4-quarter barbecue chops equals around 340 grams of meat, so that's what I've used here. I've used potatoes, which they grew at the coal mines, turnips and cabbage. And then for the evening meal, they had skilly again, just half a litre of it for the evening meal, and that could be washed down with the remaining bread that they had. And then the final part of their rations was they're allowed 28 grams of soap per day. Once a convict had his plate of food, he would have to return to his ward and eat it. Gracie's in one of the wards now, number 5 ward. There would be 20 to 30 prisoners in here, sleeping at night and eating their food. The food was served on metal containers, and they had wooden knives and forks. At one time down here there was an inspection. They found that the prisoners had no plates left or knives and forks. Now, it didn't say exactly how they were going to eat their food without those, but I'm going off what happened up at the prison up in Hobart there, where there's another source of information in regards to the same thing happening there. And basically the prisoners had to come up and their food was served onto their clothing like that, and they just ate from there, believe it or not. What I do know is that some of the civilians that work down here supervising the convicts were given rations as part of their salary, their package. They used to get a 12-month wage, and the rations were part of it. But for others down here, other civilians, the rations weren't included in their salary. And take, for example, here where Gracie is now, and I'm sure a lot of my regular viewers know that this was a cottage resided in by James Hurst. He was the mining overseer, and he had his wife and 2 kids in here. And he was given a salary at the coal mines, but the rations weren't part of his salary. So where did he go and get the food from? It must have been from here, and there must have been some type of system where they were supplied the rations, but it must have been deducted from their pay. But I can't find any record of how that was managed. Gracie and I are down at what's known as the Cottage Quarters. This is where the religious instructor resided, and the first one down here was an A low. And in regards to his rations, he was given a salary plus rations and fuel and rations for his servant. Now, he wasn't happy with that arrangement, and he complained later on that the rations for his wife and female servants wasn't sufficient. And that leads me to believe that the females who did get a ration down here from the government got a smaller ration of food than what the males did. While the convicts had their meals prepared for them by other convicts in the Cookhouse Bakehouse, the military on the top of the hill had to prepare their own food, and they had a kitchen at the back of the military barracks. And in this here, I'm not seeing any remains of anything that looks like a fireplace even. No bread oven type setup. There was a verbal account of somebody who saw 4 to 6 bread ovens situated up here somewhere, but I've never seen that in the historical records, and nor have I ever found the remains of anything that would suggest such a structure was here. This is the military commander's cottage on top of the hill near the military barracks, and originally his kitchen was in this back room here, and then at some point they built this large sandstone structure, and that became the kitchen. This area here between the original kitchen and the sandstone structure was closed off. You can see the bricks along the back here, and where Gracie's patiently sitting now is on top of a bread oven. You can see here the shape going round, and the end of the oven here, and where I'm walking now would have been the entrance to the bread oven just there. It's just become a little shortcut now between the main building and this sandstone structure, sadly. All the civilians, I believe, that worked down here had at least one, if not more, convicts assigned to them, from the superintendent level down to the overseer level. And those servants used to cook the meals for the overseers, assistant superintendents, superintendents and the like. So their cooking wasn't done where the convicts had their meals. This is the superintendent's cottage up on the hill. I suspect this was the kitchen area here at the back. As most of the structures, they seem to like to have the kitchen separate to the main living area at the time. The convicts that were sentenced to the solitary cells did not have to worry about their menu selection, as all they were allocated each day was half a kilo of bread and all the water they could drink. Now they could be in here for 48 hours up to 30 days on that menu. So there you have it, a convict's daily menu at the coal mines.